Good morning. My name is Chris Durham from Wireless Alert Solutions. I am the managing director, and I've been in the fire alarm industry for deaf and hard of hearing people for nearly 25 years. Um, this presentation, the CPD for CIBSE, is divided into three parts. The first part is looking at fire safety for deaf people and recognizing the scale of the deaf population in the UK. The second part is looking at some of the approaches you can take to providing fire provision within the building regs. And the third part is looking at some case examples of how radio solutions like our solution work within complex environments, and with some really good case studies, so you can get into the meat and potatoes there. So without further ado, the first thing to look at is the scale of the population in the UK. Now, the deaf population in the UK is unusual in that most disabled populations outside of, you could probably say, ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, you're seeing through the advent of medicines and better healthcare and other sort of early identification, the reduction in the numbers as the population goes, or at least a reduction in terms of the growth of the population. Deafness is one of those which is bucking the curve. And the reason behind this is largely because of aging. So the largest proportion of people here that you'll see who are either hearing impaired or are profoundly or severely deaf, it's due to the fact that we're living longer than we ever have done. And you combine that with a generational change in that, whereas for my grandfather's generation, they may have damaged their hearing in World War II through mortar fire or something like that. For my parents' generation, they were much more likely to have their hearing artificially aged by things like standing next to the Rolling Stones concert speakers, or going to festivals, or wearing headphones in the 80s, and so on and so forth. So there's a change in terms of usage and the damage and the abuse that we give to our eyes and our ears. I mean, God only knows what our eyes are going to be like in 20 years' time, considering we're spending our whole life staring at very small screens. So that's the first challenge, as you have a population that's growing. And as you can see here on the presentation, it's growing consistently and also quite dramatically. In the case of profoundly and severely deaf people, these are the people who are the most at risk from a fire alarm or not hearing a fire alarm. And importantly, profoundly deaf means that you can't hear sounds below around 70, sorry, severely deaf means you can't hear sounds below 70 decibels. Profoundly deaf means you can't hear anything. So, that's straightforward. But importantly, with hearing aids and other modifications, that can be adjusted. The challenge you have is a number of things. First of all, identifying deaf people, because as you'll notice from here, if we're talking around 1.2 million people in the UK who are profoundly and severely deaf, that's about the same size as the population of wheelchair users in the UK. And yet you'll see huge numbers of modifications to buildings to allow access for wheelchair users, but fire alarms for deaf people, it's not as common. And I think a large part of that is to do with the invisibility of deaf community. Because especially in an age where we are digitizing so much of our engagement with society, where you can walk into a library or you can walk into a shopping center or supermarket and you can pick up everything you want, put it in your basket, take it to the self-service till, scan it yourself, have someone come over and confirm that you are the age you thought they think you are because you've got a few gray hairs in your mustache, and then you put it in a bag and walk out, and you've not had to talk to anybody, not had to engage with anyone. And so digital technologies and streamlining of those environments has also reduced the awareness and the awareness and the sort of visible prevalence of deaf and hard of hearing people. And that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge, because deafness has struggled from being an inevitable disability for the longest time, because spotting a hearing aid, or they don't have a big D on their foreheads. That's not how deaf people operate. And to a large extent, it's incredibly convenient to just blend in with the crowd. Nobody else wants to stand out. It's not a convenience a lot of the time. So the trouble is, for fire safety, is that awareness of the risk is very, very low. It's outside of people's ken. That moment where you or I would think, oh, Is that a fire alarm? Is it a test? Is it Tuesday? What time is it? Is it 10 o'clock? Oh, it's a test. Okay. That moment is missed. And that's when a deaf person should be getting the fire alarm and should be evacuating the building. Now, to compound the problem, deafness is not a homogenous group, the same as any disability, but importantly, it's certainly the same as any auditory or stimulus disability, sensory disability. So you have some people who are born deaf, and they've grown up in deaf culture. They signed before they could speak English. They may or may not be able to lip read, and so on and so forth. For those people, their perception of their risk may be completely different from people, say, who were previously hearing, and then as they've got older have lost their hearing in one ear and then the other, and they've worn hearing aids and other things like that. But if their hearing aids aren't working that day, or if they take them out, they are profoundly deaf, or they are severely deaf. And their perception of their risk may be very different from the person who's profoundly deaf from birth, but the same risks apply. And importantly, for both groups, for one group, those who are post-hearing, if you like, they may not have even thought of it. For the other group, who are born deaf, well, they haven't died in a building yet. And like anything, when I lived in Japan, a really good example, Jishin, earthquakes are something when you move to Japan, you think, oh my goodness, this is something I'm really aware of. Very quickly, it becomes normalized. You see it on the news every day, low level, low level, low level, and you get on with your life. And so if you have a risk that potentially is very, very high, but it probably won't happen and hasn't happened yet, and I've lived for 20 years and it hasn't happened yet, how do you engage with that? How do you persuade people that there is risk there? Oh, I'll notice something. It'll be fine. This is the challenge. So we sit between three stools. We engage with fire alarm companies. We engage with technologists of radio manufacturers and so on and so forth to produce product. We engage with building operators and legislators. I'm on BSI committees and so on to look at how the standards and the product standards, and also how building design and so on, and how we can raise awareness of disability access. And on the other side, we work with disabled groups, disability access consultants, and so on and so forth, and disability access units at universities to help them the other way to raise risk assessment concerns and fire safety concerns with deaf users who may be very nonchalant about it. So it's about getting this engagement between these different groups. Now, what's changed in the last 25 years? Well, a huge amount has changed. You could divide my career over 24 years into two parts. The first part of the first 12 years was really fighting against the current. And the current was pretty slow. And what I mean by that is that, for a lot of companies that we were working with, or a lot of organizations where they'd identified this as a risk for their deaf employee, they would go and talk quite naturally to their fire alarm company. But the fire alarm company's knowledge of fire safety for deaf people was as, they didn't know as much of it as the person who was asking in the first place, to a greater extent. It was outside of their ken. And so, they would answer the same way. Well, I've never seen anybody actually die in a fire from who's deaf. So, that's it should be fine. They'll spot something. We'll put a visual alarm on their desk. We'll put a visual alarm in the disabled toilet, that kind of thing. And this kind of minimization occurred for a very long time. Interestingly, things changed in 2013 with the introduction of the SEM 5423, which is the visual alarm standards. And that changed things dramatically, because suddenly it changed visual alarms from being an inconvenience to a central part of thinking about what the next upgrade, or the next sort of, if you like, the next layer of sophistication was for addressable fire alarm systems. So suddenly the fire alarm companies and a lot of the industry was going, no, this is something we really believe in and engage with. And that's fantastic. It really is. You can be cynical about it, but frankly, it's changed the conversation. And importantly, it's flipped the script, and it's changed the conversation from a conversation of if, which was very much the case, to a conversation of when. And that's an important distinction. And it creates wider recognition for this invisible disability. So I've produced this chart. This is from back in 2018. And really, it's just trying to chart where I saw the differences for our little slice our little niche market. And at the top of it, you've got the impact of Grenfell, which was huge in 2018. It was 2017 that the Grenfell disaster happened. There's still dozens of buildings that have the same cladding and the same risk, and yet it sort of tapers away. And that again, it's that definition of, oh, this is a high risk, and then suddenly it sort of drops away. In the meantime, obviously Brexit has continued to have an impact. It has an impact on us, has an impact on the whole of industry. Importantly, where we are in a niche, we're not big importers. We're not sort of, we're able to cope with it fairly well. The third thing, and this is really what the chart's all about, is the impact of VADs and how that is changing the conversation of fire safety and changing it from a conversation of if to a conversation of when, and that's really important. So when you're talking about fire alarm solutions for deaf people, really there's only two main approaches within British standards, and you've got three examples below, but I'll highlight why in a moment. The two main examples I give are the approach of visual alarms and looking at tactile, mobile, or portable devices, so vibrating units. And those vibrating units can come from a number of radio-based sources, but in the main, what they are is tactile pagers. So you have a pager. They can be a mobile or portable unit. So, for example, in here you have a mobile unit here, the pager, and then you have a portable unit here, which is now in this particular case, this is an acoustically triggered system. You have to be, I would have certain reservations about that. Certainly, I think it's a good solution for things like hotels and overnight stays and things like that. I do have reservations about things like residential accommodation and stuff like that for long term, mainly because of the risk of you can just put a jumper on top of it and potentially muffle your fire alarm, which isn't something we should really worry about, but that's something that could happen. We've also had case examples at universities where one university in particular, London University, where the fire alarm, this kept vibrating, and what it was the person next door to the deaf gentleman, the deaf student, knew that the person next door was deaf and would turn his TV up loud. And when you put the TV on, if it hit a certain note or certain tone for a period of time and it came through the wall, the deaf guard was activating. And yeah, that was challenging. And certainly you could tune things and tweak things, I think, but it's just being aware of the fact that that's acoustically triggered. That's well worth being aware of. Having an example at a hotel, very prestigious hotel in London, where they were using this extensively, they were happy with it, and then they changed the fire alarm over from a acoustic fire alarm to a voice fire alarm. So it would go, this is a fire alarm. And of course, for an acoustic system, how does it tell the difference between that and this and this? And this leads me on to second point, which is we've had two systems going in the last year where the risk was for users who had hearing aids in one site and had a cochlear implant in the other. And the software within those systems actually occluded the fire alarm, thinking it was feedback loop. So that's quite a big thing. And they adopted a DeafWatch system as appropriate. So this is the kind of things you need to be aware of in terms of acoustic systems, whether it's hearing aids or whether it's acoustic alarm. These situations can happen, and they are to an extent manageable. Obviously, if it's a voice fire alarm, how does the system tell the difference between that and the television or a conversation in the room? It's very, very difficult. So challenges. So here's a big question. Your smartphone. Your smartphone is a fantastic device. It's incredibly clever, but is it a safe device? Is it appropriate for having a fire alarm signal coming in through a smartphone? I would argue no. And I've looked at this quite a lot, and we were very serious about looking at this as a development. The challenge you have is twofold. Firstly, from a user direction, we are quite used to ignoring our phones. We've kind of learned that. So how do you get the attention of a user how do you differentiate your fire alarm signal from, say, a WhatsApp group blowing up or the notifications coming through? And remember, everything within this has to vibrate because that's the only way a deaf person's going to know about it. And mobile phones have been transformative for deaf people, absolutely transformative. But there's lots of questions there over how the user responds to the device. And importantly, if it's a device which is being is your mode of communication for so many different nodes. How do you ensure that message gets through? Secondarily to that, how do you stop that phone being turned into airplane mode or do not disturb because they're in a lecture, or they turn the phone off, or they there's lots of ways in which that phone can be by the user controlled, and you don't have any say over how that does. Now that is direct contradiction of the British Standard I'll get into in a minute, which says the signal must be received within 5 seconds. It must repeat every 10 seconds. And importantly, the unit must not be allowed to be turned off. So there's some challenges there in how do you block that unit. So you start off with something that looks like a phone that people would want, and then you end up with something that looks like a tank. And actually, you're reducing the functionality in such a way that it really does reduce what the phone is capable of doing. That's a concern for me. There may be a way around that, but that is a concern for me, both in terms of how it works and how it operates. The second question I have is one of signal. And that's really interesting because the mobile phone, in lots of ways, we're using it as a passive device. Mobile phone isn't a passive device, it's an active device. When it does the whole thing about, I've got a WhatsApp come through and everything else, the phone, the server isn't contacting the phone is contacting the server and saying, have you got any messages? And so on and so forth. That's why we go in and out of signal and so on and so forth. So we have a device that behaves like a passive device, but actually needs to be actively engaged to engage. And that's challenging. That's really, really challenging, because the problem is, as we know, is if you don't have signal, you look at your phone, you try and make a phone call, you try and look on the internet, and I don't have signal. So you move to where the signal is. That moment when the fire alarm goes off, that's not a convenience that you have. And that's the challenge that I think exists. Now, you can complement that by looking at LTE networks and boosting signal through your building and all these different things. But at the core of it is Vodafone or Motorola or O2 or any of the mobile phone companies who really have a model which is a user access model. Are they there to provide your fire alarm signal? Would they say that they're providing that monitored service? Is that their duty? Where does that break down? And that's challenging. And if you have an LTE network and so on, and you boost the signal throughout your buildings and you have a battery backup on it and you put monitoring on it, you've added a lot, but actually what you've done is you've duplicated technology which is outside of the British standards. And that's the challenge. I'm sure there's lots of fire alarm companies who'd love to just use a Wi-Fi network to do fire alarms. They don't. Why don't they? And what you're doing for the hearing people, you should really be doing for the disabled people. So that's important. That's really important. So getting signal inside a building, the security of that signal inside the building, the ability to stay ahead of hackers or interpreters, because suddenly you're on the internet and everything's available to everything. Your app has to stay ahead of things. So there's lots of layers of cost and everything else on there. And how long does it take for that deaf student to go, oh, this is annoying, I need the space on my phone, and they just delete the app? So, yeah, what seems like a really convenient way of moving forwards and a really simple solution has lots of different challenges in terms of providing security of signal. And importantly, from a building operator point of view, not from a user point of view, but from a building operator point of view, you need to know that it works, that it's guaranteed, that it's tested, and that it complies with the British standards. So there's big questions there. So how does deaf paging compare? Well, it keeps it really simple. I mean, paging has been around since the 1960s. It's incredibly robust. It's really simple. The fire is detected. The fire alarm goes off. The fire alarm activates the deaf watch. The deaf watch broadcasts, the deaf pager broadcasts. The pager vibrates. And because that pager is operating on a signal, which is, if you look at a pager like this, is operating on a signal which is just coming through to one person to do one thing. And it could be a signal for 1 building, 2 buildings, 3 buildings, 4 buildings. But importantly, it's not trying to compete with your nan's WhatsApps or the mates blowing up about something or the updates from a game you're playing or whatever it is. It's vibrating for a specific thing continuously until you get out of that building. And importantly, you can also send a message like this saying, fire alarm geography building, evacuate to Library Square. You can give the best information to the deaf person in the building, whereas everyone else is going, oh, there's a fire alarm, we better get out. Where do we go? That deaf person knows exactly where to go and where to leave from. So it keeps it simple. It's a direct communication. It's what's called a simulcast technology. So this is the idea that rather than going like a digital technology, going number one, number two, number three, number four, I'm broadcasting into each of you in turn. That adds up microseconds in between. Instead, it just goes, everybody in range, pick this up, and you can have 1, 5, 50, 5,000 pages on the end of it, and they're all vibrated. It's a second infrastructure, so with just one transmitter and the pages, you've basically got the equivalent in terms of battery backup and monitoring that you have with the fire alarm system. So that's the idea. So very straightforwardly, you're replicating the fire alarm system in terms of network, and it's manageable and measurable. And what I mean by that, and I'll show you in a second, you have the ability to go around and test and see what the signal's like. And importantly, like with when we're talking about mobile phone providers, their signal improves and goes up and down and depends on user statistics and how do they hit the highest number of users at any one time. They don't, that's not, guaranteeing signal in this corner of this room is not their priority. So, those two things are coming at it from a completely different point of view and a completely different market and a completely different customer base and a completely different success. Their KPIs are totally different. So you can measure that. And importantly as well, if you have a paging system like ours, we would go with the most serious radio license to give you both security signal and also security legacy wise, so that you can say, okay, we will have this signal in this area moving forward and we are protected. A page has a very long battery life. If you put a AA battery in it, it'll last 12 to 16 weeks. Put it into context. Compare that to a mobile phone of 2 to 3 days. So you don't have to remember to recharge it all the time. And even on a rechargeable phone, you'll get 8 weeks out of it rechargeable pager, you'll get 8 weeks out of it quite happily because it's a genuinely passive device. It's not doing anything apart from running its small voltage until it receives a signal from the transmitter. Lightweight, weighs way less than a mobile phone and at comparatively low cost. So you're talking about something which is very cost effective, and then we'll go into sort of cost comparison. So here's the part that CIBSE really liked. So this is an examination between the visual alarms and paging and looking at their strengths and weaknesses, because they do have them. So for visual alarms, it's about public spaces. So when you look at a building and you're looking at a hybrid solution and you're thinking about, well, should I use deaf paging? Should I use visual alarms? Look at the public spaces. Look at those spaces where you'd have unmanaged environments where you've got users coming in and out of that environment that you don't know who they are. They could be deaf, they might not be, and so on and so forth. And you don't know. So shopping centers, supermarkets, atriums of buildings, lift lobbies, disabled toilets, anywhere where you are unsure and that's a public area, then visual alarms is probably the way to go. The downsides of it is you are basically upgrading the fire alarm. That's what you're doing. So effectively, you are adding more nodes, more points, more addressable points onto a fire alarm, and that consequently has a more complex fire alarm because you have to add addressable points and they can only hold so many. And then you're also adding in battery backup and so on and so forth because they do have a drawer. So you have to deal with things like variable lux levels. So you have to make sure you have the right number of visual alarms to get the attention. So you can no longer sort of skimp and have one visual alarm and a huge window next door to it because the visual alarm looks like a, I've seen installations like that before. They're great fun. And importantly, it's comparatively complicated to test because you've got to think about lux levels during the summer and the winter, and comparatively complicated to design. And importantly, costly to install. So they are expensive. Now, you can make the argument, and many do, that of course you've got visual alarms which are upgrades of existing sounders. So you can upgrade the sounder and you have a visual alarm that's also a sounder. Absolutely. And that's usually just one node, so it's 1 for 1. That's perfect. But of course, sound goes through doors and sound goes around corners in a way that light doesn't. So you're going to have more visual alarm. That's just a part and parcel of the physics. Light doesn't go around corners in the same way that sound bounces. So that's something to take into consideration. It will be a more sophisticated, complicated fire alarm by the time you finish with visual alarms everywhere. But if you focus them on the public access areas, then importantly, as soon as somebody moves through an RFID door or access control or goes into the office or enters the campus or whatever it is, the school grounds, all the rest of it, deaf paging wins. And importantly, it wins because it's about addressing that user. And let me put this in context. I've got sites like at Bedford College or the sites we've had at University of Northampton. We've got a case example of that in a minute, where you can cover dozens of buildings. You know, you could cover 10 buildings with a single transmitter. As long as the fire, as long as the links back to the central fire alarm are secure, absolutely, you can cover as many buildings as you can get coverage of. And the more powerful the system you have, the more buildings that you can cover. The lighter weight the buildings are, the more buildings you can cover. The maximum number of flat pack concrete buildings I've covered with a single transmitter. That was hard work. Took a lot of survey to do, but we covered 10 buildings with a single transmitter, flat pack concrete. So we're talking about, on the back of a lorry arrives, so hyperdense concrete with steel reinforcement in it. So the worst Faraday cage you can imagine. And that's something to consider as well, is the coverage is down to the type of construction and the space on the campus. Great examples in a moment. So as soon as you have a managed environment, so you know your users, you know the students who are coming to college or university every year and so on and so forth, you can allocate pages to them, at which point they are completely free to go anywhere. And you can cover 10 buildings with a single transmitter. So the cost value drops through the floor, absolutely drops through the floor. Relatively simple to install. You're talking about, best example I've got in a minute is 2 to 3 hours usually to install and commission. A lot of the time we'll bring the transmitter, have it mounted, and then come back and commission it afterwards. It usually takes about an hour. So really, really straightforward. Really straightforward to get coverage, to maintain coverage, to confirm coverage. And importantly, the capital cost is low and the battery cost is very low, because you're talking about a 2.3 or 5 or 7.5 amp hour battery. That's it. So what's the downsides? Well, you do have to engage with the users. You do have to train your users. So this user training requirement, you have a user responsibility. They do actually have to carry a pager and let them know. And a good question from a lot of people is, how many pages do you have back there? Do they break the pages all the time? And the short answer is no, we don't have a big turnover in pages. A great example, we've just been approached by Bedford College, who've been on board since 2006. No, tell a lie, 2008. And they asked us for some more pages, and originally asked for 20 and said, yeah, here's the price of 20. And they go, actually, we need 3. And that's how much losses they've had. It's really, really slight, and that's the thing, is that the users generally, because this is part of their fire safety system, so they usually look after the pages. The worst abusers are security personnel. They don't look after pages at all. And front of house staff on theatres. We've got some systems in with them, and they really don't look after pages at all. They come back in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and back panels missing, and all sorts of things. So yeah, absolutely. But in the scheme of things, yeah, we don't have a huge turnover in pages. So how do we guarantee coverage? Well, you walk the building. This is Bloomberg Place in London. It's huge. It's one of the, I think it's the largest footprint building in Western Europe, and certainly in terms of density. It's 300 meters aside. It's 2 towers here, and then it's got 4 stories underground. So these are 9 floors, and then there's 4 stories underground here. It's huge. It's got more steel in it than the Eiffel Tower. It's got more concrete in it than anything I've ever seen. And we don't cover it with 1 transmitter. We have more than 1 transmitter in there. But to give you an idea, in the basement, we have 1, 2, 3 transmitters that cover syncopated signals, which mean that you will receive a signal from one of the 3 transmitters within 10 seconds, but you may receive a signal if you're standing in the middle from all 3 within 10 seconds. So either your page is going really, really crazy, or it's going a little bit crazy, one of the 2. But importantly, you're getting the fire alarm message everywhere. And how do we know the fire alarm message is coming through? Because we test every single room. And that's really, really important. You go through and you check the signal down the back alley, up here and down here, and you go through the plant room and you climb up the back area and you go down this back corridor and you even check the signal over here by beep. and so on. So it's a lot of work doing surveys. To put it into context, it takes it's about 16 kilometers to walk around this building and do the surveys. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to do the surveys at Bloomberg. So it's a fair amount of work. But put that into context, it took a total of 16 days, surveys, installations, and commissioning to commission this system. A colleague of mine, Andy, he was there for 2 years putting in the LTE system for the mobile phone network with trickle feed antennas and so on and so forth. So it's just a whole different bag in terms of signal quality. Why are we able to get the signal quality like that? Well, that's down to the license that we use and the frequency that we use. We don't muck around with that. We use a technically assigned license, and we use a frequency which was specifically selected by Ofcom for building penetration and into building penetration. So it's really, really good at getting signal through a building and out of a building and through the next building if it can do that. But you can turn the power down and turn the power up appropriately. And that's the way we approach it. And importantly, in terms of signal quality, that gives us the best, I think, in class signal quality and coverage potential. Other competitors of ours might use a simple site license or a self-select license. That effectively is a as it says, self-select. It's a self-regulated license. I don't think I'm interfering with anybody else. I'm putting in here, I've checked with the scanner and it's okay. The reason why it's done like that is they're limited to 2 watts maximum output, whereas we've got anything up to 25 watt potential output on this license. So it gives you an idea of the kind of scale. And the difference is with the manual frequency coordinated or technically assigned license, Ofcom do a test. So put into context, excuse me, technically assigned license costs £7,500 a year, then self-select license costs £50 for 5 years. It's not the same thing. And the reason is that the technically assigned license is a license which they'll often turn around and say, no, you can't have that frequency in that area because, and then you have to work out how you get correct frequency and so on and so forth. So it really is a much higher license quality, and it gives you the kind of legacy protection because you are guaranteed that frequency. As long as you have that license, you're guaranteed that frequency in that location, and you can only have a certain number of people in that area who are using that license. So it really cuts out a lot of interference points. So let me give you an example of a hybrid solution. So this is a hybrid solution which was proposed and we did with fire alarm company for Westminster City Hall. And this is a great example because this is a 19-story building. 1 transmitter covers this building. So you have 1 transmitter in behind reception, and that covers the whole of the building. And importantly, the fire alarm company focused all the fire alarms. So the underground car park has visual alarms everywhere. The foyers, the lift lobbies, and the foyer has it. The lift lobbies have it. The atrium has it, and the disabled toilets have visual alarms. And then everywhere else through the RFID door is covered by the Death Watch system. We have complete coverage of the building. So in terms of the signal, in terms of the coverage, in terms of the propagation, you've resolved a huge building with a very straightforward situation. And this installation commissioning took less than 3 hours. I think it was 2 hours and a little bit. And that included climbing 19 floors straight up twice. And importantly as well, this cost saving from removing the visual alarms from all of these outdoor spaces and all the lux levels around the outside. And as you can see, it's got windows on every floor, every side. So removing those visual alarms saved £80,000 in kit from the build. So it's a win-win, and everybody was happy. So what we usually provide, if you come and do a CCPD with us, is we then have documentation and case examples and all sorts of documentation that you can look at to give you an idea of if you're looking at warehousing or older buildings or modern constructions or flat pack concrete buildings, what our system can do. Because we want you to be in a position where you can say, I think this can do it. Importantly, also feel free to contact us. We're really easy like that. We can look at Google Maps, we can look at plans, we can look at your, the PDFs and say, yeah, coverage is not a problem, or yeah, would need to survey, or maybe 2 transmitters, that kind of thing. Give you a really good idea. This is a great example. This campus doesn't exist, but it makes me very nostalgic. I worked there from 2006 to 2018. They had 35 buildings across 25 evacuation zones, and just 3 transmitters provided coverage of 89 acres. And importantly, That's not working at the full power. That was working at 2.1 watts. We turned the power down because the coverage was that good. Why was the coverage that good? Not a lot of concrete. Not a lot of concrete. So this is all sort of 60s to 80s buildings. There was not a lot of concrete, a lot of brick, bit of steel, but not much. And we got coverage all the way from Cottersbrook, right the way over to Sunley Management Centre, right the way out here, and all the way around these. And the transmitters were installed here. So central point, broadcasting all locations, and the signal was that good they could use it for not just the deaf students and getting deaf students and deaf members of staff out, but also security carried around pages as well. And they come up and say, fire alarm, this building, get evacuated to here. Now, importantly, and this is a good question we get quite a lot, is can we limit the signal? Absolutely, that's not an issue. But there's a balancing act to be made. In this particular case, because the deaf users were used to it, they went, oh yeah, I don't mind. No problem. I get told when the fire alarm's happening in buildings I'm not in. We have a nighttime coding for the nighttime buildings so that you would never get woken up for that building if it was another fire alarm. So the idea being that global coding would cover every building. So you pick up, so your pager that's a global pager would be beside the bed, and then you have a nighttime pager which you can wear. And importantly, that one only vibrates for the building that you're in. That's an important distinction. So you don't want to get woken up in the middle of the night for the building in, or even the middle of the day, because when do students sleep? It's up all night, sleep all day type of scenario. But importantly, with that signal, the users became normalized to the fact that they would know where the fire alarm was and they'd have best information on the campus. And that's an important distinction. Other sites we've done where we limit that and we reduce that down, we reduce the signal down and we try and limit the signal to just the building they're in. But as you imagine, it's very hard to do because unless your building is a perfect circle with no windows and everything else, getting the signal to perfectly sculpt its way around a building is very hard because as soon as you put a window in there, you've got a big hole that the signal is going to go out. So as soon as it hits the outside, it's going to go far farther than it does inside. And so signal quality and understanding where the signal goes and stuff is a bit of a fine art. So it's not really something you can do off the shelf. This is the last example. This is the smallest, densest building we provide coverage for. And this is the CNC Civil Nuclear Constabulary in Sellafield. It is a very much concrete steel building. It's an indoor gun range for special services and police forces and so on to practice live fire drills, basically. And effectively, every part of this building here is, as you can see here, is imported plate steel clad onto dense concrete walls on every surface, ceilings, floors, every surface. And so getting coverage in there was a challenge, We were only asked to cover the admin block, this bit at the end, so the black bit here you see over here. And we ended up covering signal in all of the areas around here, the 100-meter gun range, the 50-meter gun range, the rappel area, the storage area at the back here. The only place we didn't get coverage, although we weren't supposed to, but we didn't get coverage, was a couple of the rooms in the CQB area. Which is close quarters battle, so 3-story area where you're kicking indoors and closing rooms and things like that. That's the only area where we couldn't get signal. And that's because it was basically concrete on steel on concrete on steel on concrete on steel. So fascinating buildings. One of the reasons why I love doing the job I do, you get to see the most extraordinary buildings. And yeah, that's the densest building we did. So I like to finish with a really good case example. And this is a really good one, came out of University of West England originally, and this is the Hero Arm. It's something that I think is really good by Open Bionics. And what I like about it is they identified not just a need for a prosthetic which was more fitted to the child, that was sized for them and could be adjusted to grow as they grew. But also, I thought the really clever part was they went out to the likes of Marvel and DC and other sort of games producers and software producers and things like that, and asked them for licenses so that they could actually produce an Iron Man arm or a Batman arm or a computer game arm. And I thought that was really inspirational because what it does is it changes that conversation, that flip, it changes that conversation of a prosthetic being something that is potentially something that makes a student stand out in a negative way and turning that into something that's absolutely makes them the envy of their friends. And I think that's a wonderful way to finish. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and please feel free to contact us if you wish to.